Hey guys, this is your High Fist here with a special episode of, I don't really have a Dear Dr. Fantasy like Dr. Philip Chase, but this is kind of a special episode. I have the first sword of Malas Tube with me. I shy away from referring to him as a booktuber because, like me, he's not really a booktuber. He's someone who does more serious analysis on narrative structure and stuff like that. AP, we've done about 7 videos together at this point, but this is the first time we're actually going to be discussing the 10 big books. As you guys know, AP is not just an advanced reader for Erikson, but AP is also one of the fundamental characters of Crackpot Trail and the Fiends of Nightmaria as well. AP is one of the few people who can actually change my mind on a particular topic because AP always relies on logical arguments. And of course, AP, like me, does not take himself too seriously. So that also makes it a sort of a easy place to start, right? And besides, Philip and I did a video a couple of months ago, AP, where you got your fair end of bashing. So it's only fair that you and I get together now and we throw a few pot shots at Philip. But thank you so much for joining me, AP.
It is fantastic to be here in discussion with the High Fist himself, being part of one of, I believe, the juicy videos. And
Exactly.
You know what? I love these conversations because both of us, obviously we come from radically different parts of the world, but we share some common educational experiences, and then diverge again in different areas that we were educated in. And we're brought together by these books and we come at them from different angles. We always pick up on different aspects of it. And it's through us arguing in the academic sense or discussing things in the more common sense that it brings both of us a new appreciation of different points of view and perspective and new understanding. And, you know, clearly that happens when we talk, not obviously with Philip Chase, who is a nemesis and, you know, it's useless. No one should watch his channel.
Absolutely. I mean, come on. The guy has like 5 times as many subscribers as you do, and you have 5 times as many subscribers as I do. So Philip needs no help from the two of us.
Well, clearly it's because he talks about Beowulf, and that's it. We need to get rid of the Malazan content and focus on Beowulf. That's where all of the subscribers lie.
Exactly. You didn't bring that up in your last collab with him at all. It was him. Yeah, exactly. So anyway, AP, I wanted us to discuss something that I think the two of us have a bit of a unique experience on because we are among we come from post-colonial societies. You and I live with the repercussions of colonialism in some way or the other, unlike many of our transatlantic friends who claim to be sort of the subjects of colonial culture and all that, but not really. You and I, we've lived through the consequences of colonialism and things like that. And Erikson, I would say, does one of the best jobs that I can think of exploring imperialism and colonialism, themes like cultural appropriation, moral relativism, the environmental repercussions of ever expanding colonies and stuff like that. So maybe we should start with a very general question first. When you encountered the 10 big books, what was your major impression? Because surely it must have made an impression on how he treated colonization. So what were your initial thoughts?
Well, it's something we see in Gardens of the Moon. And I'm probably going to preface this by framing it. In a lot of traditional fantasy, you get set up with the heroes and they're trying to take down the evil empire, or the good nobles who are trying to fight off the invading barbarians. And when you think about the structure of a lot of those narratives, it's coming down on setting up the group of heroes who know what's best for everyone else. And by overthrowing the evil empire, you know, it's, oh, we don't like the tyranny. And really what those novels tend to end up, or those series end up with, is the good guys become the new people in charge. And you still have that stratified hierarchical structure at the end, but now the good king is in place who knows what's best for the people. So the narrative in that instance quite often focuses on placing the right people in power, but not challenging the structure of power, or even trying to understand the complexity of the power relationship, the power dynamic. In the narratives in which there's the invading barbarian horde and those sorts of invasion narratives, and it doesn't have to be barbarian hordes. You get a lot of different invasion narratives or intrusion narratives where the good guys are fighting off the evil that's coming in. And again, trying to maintain then the status quo. When I read Gardens of the Moon, one of the first things that struck me, that actually made me stop and immediately reread the section, was at the end of the Siege of Peel, when it describes that Moonspawn has drifted away, and then the Moranth get their hour of blood. And I went, oh, hang on a sec, these are the colonial oppressors. And I went back to the very beginning of the book before going on any further, and I reread the prologue all the way up to that point. And it stuck out to me that there was a tension, a very deliberate tension between the perspective resting initially with the Malazans, where we always assume then is these are the good guys. We're going to follow the heroes. That was an assumption I'd made in my head, that we're going to follow these heroes. Yet everything that we see them do is actually horrendous. That there's a riot in the home city and they send in the army to slaughter their own citizens. An army officer kills a peasant woman out of hand and just walks off. That suddenly I realized there was a complexity of how it was being represented. So my antenna were up looking for this. And then that's when you start picking up on the movement between the Malazan sort of side with the bridge burners and the Daru side, the Darujistani people. And it was portraying, this phrase gets overlooked, it's a both sides argument, but it wasn't trying to sort of portray both sides. It was saying, listen, this is a complex situation. See it from their perspective, see it from their perspective. And then breaking out those perspectives into, well, Baruch the High Alchemist is in the upper echelons. Crocus is in the lower echelons. That it's not just about sides in a war, but there are classes within a war. There are all of these different aspects. And then when you have your eye open for a lot of this stuff, you realize that very few of the characters are described in any way that you could think of as Caucasian. That this was actually complicating and challenging the Eurocentric notion that a lot of us instinctively map on to fantasy works when we read them, because particularly of the impact of Tolkien. And so that was my first instance of noticing it right there in Gardens of the Moon. This constant movement between these positions, never taking a simplistic sort of rendition of it and saying, oh, but all the Malazans are this, all the Daru are that. And we see that then played out in increasing complexity and increasing nuance throughout the rest of the series as new instances are brought up, new points of comparison are brought up, new challenges to that are brought up. That it wasn't just about saying colonialism bad. It was, let's look at these interactions because they are complex interactions and coming from, as you said, like a post-colonial society or a colonial post-colonial, if you want to straddle that divide, that it isn't all about, oh yeah, you hate the other side. It's understanding that there is a tension between the different positions, and you're constantly negotiating that, both in terms of identity, in terms of accent, in terms of education, in terms of how you live, all of these different aspects. That concept of identity, cultural, national identity, which so many people take for granted, is actually fluid. And seeing that play out quite literally in the Malazan Book of the Fallen was very, very eye-opening for something that wasn't trying to be didactic about it, wasn't it wasn't a polemic screed, but it was putting it on the page for everyone to see.
So let me ask you this, AP, because you obviously know a lot more about. By the way, guys, for those of you who haven't visited AP's channel and you're subscribed to mine, you must be living under a rock or something like that. So AP has a PhD in fantasy literature and all that. So the one thing I want to ask you, AP, regarding this was, because you probably know the answer. So is Erikson working off a tradition of nuanced commentary in the fantasy genre about colonialism, or is this a sort of standout book where Erikson brings his own sort of perspective as an anthropologist? Because I personally, I'm not very well read in the fantasy and sci-fi genre, but to me, this was completely different. So is there a wellspring of existing, or was there a wellspring of subtle commentary, of two-sided commentary that Erikson was drawing from, or was this Erikson's doing?
Well, first of all, like, when we think about the fantasy genre, we often oversimplify it. We sort of go Tolkien and then, but obviously the fantasy genre is made up of a whole load of different influences that we sort of coalesce together in and around roughly the time of Tolkien, even though, yes, there are lots of precursor texts. There are lots of texts that you would now identify as fantasy, that even at the time may have been referred to as magical romance or planetary romance or sword and sorcery. That there were all of these different terms, but really the genre coalesces in around Tolkien. And then because of that, there was almost an ossification where people tried to mimic what Tolkien was doing, which narrowed the genre quite substantially. And a lot of the other texts that were fantasy texts sit outside it. But what the point of me saying all of that was, there are always exceptions to it. You can talk about a general trend, but there will always be exceptions that both predate it, happen at the same time. And so I'm not saying that Erikson invented this. There are other texts, but there wasn't a tradition of it, at least to my mind, being established. Now, multiple points of view, that's a very well-known, well-established tradition. Multiple points of view on a conflict. Yes, we have that. The famous films sometimes show us the other side of the conflict. But within fantasy, again, a lot of it was focused on the hero's journey, the hero's story, the heroic side, where they were the protagonists and the antagonist would come into their story. And when the antagonist was shown, they were shown, again, from the perspective of a protagonist. So the antagonist was always evil. Even in their own perspective, the antagonist was evil. But as we well know, most people don't think of themselves as the villain. Most people think of themselves as the hero of their own story. And so if you were showing the story from the antagonist position, it should feel justified. It should feel that they think they're doing the right thing. They have reasons for doing it that way. And again, in a lot of other genres, that gets explored quite significantly. But I think what Erikson did was, for something that is epic fantasy, something that was very much in the vein and style of Tolkien, but he drew on, yes, the anthropological training he had, which I think has served him very, very well in creating complex societies that aren't just bare analogs of a sort of simplified Disney form of existing societies. So he used the anthropological aspect. He also, as a student of writing, was well aware of the modernist and postmodernist movements and about trying to deconstruct texts, about taking tropes and picking them apart and subverting them or inverting them or using them for a different effect, because there's an expected reaction to it. And if you know that, then you can manipulate it to create a different reaction. So he was well aware of that. He was also reacting, I think, against some of the ossification of those narrative strategies, where it was, yes, it's going to be Freytag's pyramid, because a lot of Western literature, particularly in fantasy writing, fell into that mode of introduction, instigating event, rising action, climax, falling action, denouement. And there's your novel structure. But novels can do more than that. So I don't think it was any one thing. I think all of those things fed into it. And then his own personal background. The child of immigrants living in Canada and then moving to England and being a foreigner in another land. And that can significantly impact your perception of the world. Being a foreigner living somewhere, and where that other place does not privilege your experience as a foreigner. They don't go, oh, you're one of the fancy people. They more look at you as, oh, you're one of those immigrants, are you? Those are two radically different experiences of a foreigner in a foreign land. One of the colonizer and one of the colonized. In analogy, not quite that, but to give you an idea of that power dynamic. So you can see how much of this can play into, if you're going to write a fantasy story, what are you going to write about? What are you challenging? And that, I think it was Erikson's argument with his perception of what the genre was, his argument with what he perceived to be the ossified elements or the expected elements of military or epic fantasy. And also trying to use the techniques of the authors and stories that he admired, that he wanted to use himself, that he wanted to replicate. And that created a melange of an approach that allowed for a lot of post-structural, postmodern, deconstructionalist attempts, which means breaking down power structures, breaking down hierarchies, challenging those assumptions. That's all part and parcel of that ethos.
Yeah, I completely agree. And the other thing that I want to discuss with you was, so obviously for readers of fantasy fiction, this can be quite jarring. For readers of fantasy fiction who are used to this fixed narrative of how empires are portrayed, especially modern readers where empires are usually either the evil empire or the protagonist side or whatever. I mean, we see this with characters like Birithil, where Erikson sets up a specific problem that historically colonial societies have had to deal with, where you have indigenous customs that are not quite sort of up to the human rights standards, let's say, or if we were to just use female genital mutilation. And we ourselves have seen readers and heard readers complain about the inclusion of stuff like that in the 10 big books. So it's obviously been jarring for many readers as well. So as a writer, what do you think Erikson has done to, do you think Erikson should do something to address the, because obviously we have the Witness trilogy that will have a lot of these themes of colonization and stuff like that, or do you think Erikson should just do his own thing? I know it's a random question, but it's always been something that I've been quite curious about.
Well, what's fascinating is even people who have complained about the inclusion of these things in Erikson's work. Now, and obviously there are different complaints about them. One is it should never be included because I just want to be entertained and I don't want to look at that stuff. Another complaint could be this was very distressing and it was deeply upsetting and I couldn't continue reading, which is a different complaint. And another complaint was Erikson didn't handle it well enough, which is a different type of complaint. So they're all complaining about the same thing, but for very different reasons. And of course, if someone is deeply upset by viewing this, that it is setting off some sort of psychological trauma, you have to be entirely cognizant of that and very sympathetic, because it was never Erikson's intent to cause someone psychological trauma. That, I don't think any author wants to harm their readership. So, that's a very valid complaint that you would have to say, yes, absolutely. But the idea of it shouldn't be included because I just want to be entertained, that's presupposing an expectation of the genre that because it is fantasy, it should not deal with these difficult or complex or morally repugnant or psychologically devastating aspects from our world. And yet there are hundreds of books, thousands of books in contemporary lit, in specific mimetic fiction that deal with these things. And we would never say to them, you're not allowed to write about trauma. You're not allowed to write about this. And the expectation is, well, those are serious books. They're allowed to deal with serious matters. But fantasy is silly. Fantasy is just fun and entertainment, and it shouldn't deal with these things. And that is patently ridiculous. And I do not accept the premise of that argument. I don't think that that is a defensible position, because fantasy literature is literature. Literature always has, and always will, or at least always should, have room for these things, regardless of any specific genre. Horror has frequently dealt with aspects of horrible things that happen in real life, has used literalized, supernaturalized metaphors for aspects of the body and bodily autonomy, about political and ideological things. And it's used horror as a way to discuss it. You go, well, that's all fine. Fantasy, in the broadest possible term, we can think of animal fables that deal with very difficult political aspects or historical aspects. Science fiction routinely investigates all of these things. So why is it that in fantasy, that is written for adults, it is not written for very young children? Therefore, there's no risk of exposure to a small child of this stuff, which would maybe be inappropriate. But this is for adults. Why are we saying that that should be censored out? We shouldn't. And this is one of the things that I think Tolkien unintentionally caused in the genre, which was a shying away from real world aspects like this, because he created a mythic story form. He was going for myth and legend. That was his vision. That was part of what he was writing. And because of that, we copied it, and a lot of authors copied it, less mythic, but more adventure. And you go, right, so mythic and adventure, these are slightly different things, but again, they're not focusing on, quite often, on real world aspects, except maybe tangentially. But what Erikson did, looking at the Vietnam War fiction and the Korean War fiction, looking at those traditions, looking at realist fiction, litfic and contemporary fiction, all of those stories dealt with some of the darkest aspects of the human condition, of barbarity committed during war, of horrendous things that good guys have done on the side of good, of moments of compassion from the bad guys, moments of horror from the bad guys, that no side was blameless, that there was a lot of culpability going on, regardless of who was right or who was wrong, because war is an incredibly dirty business. And if you're not going to include that, if you're not going to include those psychological ramifications or those aspects tied to some of the, like, why do we have war crimes legislation? Because war crimes happen. And if we don't address that in the fiction, we're doing a disservice. Now, that is not to say that all fantasy must do that. Of course not. We like heroic fantasy, adventure fantasy. We like having variety. And so when Erikson decided to take this particular path to investigate these things, to shine light on them, it wasn't to say that he was trying to address all wrongs, but these were ones that he decided he had not seen investigated, or had not seen investigated in this way, that he thought it was important to include. It was important to include because it was addressing something he felt needed to be addressed, or should be addressed, or could be addressed better in the genre. And to be perfectly honest, that's what all authors do when they write. They try to write the story that they want to read that no one else has done. And that's what Erikson has done with this. And I think it is very difficult for readers who are expecting adventure, high adventure and daring do and swashbuckling heroes on the side of right. armed with moral purity, to see something that is grittier in its humanity, the grains of sand in our souls portrayed like that, and the decisions that we make that sometimes are to exploit others, that is shown in quite stark terms across the series.
So what made the 10 big books escape this ossification that you described? Is it because, as you say, Erikson has deep roots of inspiration outside of the fantasy genre? Is that what primarily makes the 10 big books escape this curse?
Well, I think every author builds on their own experience. Joe Abercrombie, I believe he has training as a psychologist or some aspect of that. And so he brings a lot of that to the psychological realism of his characters. And no one would say, oh, how do you make your characters so psychologically real? Justify why you have done this. We don't, because psychological realism is part and parcel of what we expect to find. But when we see something like female genital mutilation mentioned in a novel, and it's not immediately the good guy sweep in to fix it, that sort of, it is unsettling, and it unbalances us. We go, well, if I was there, I would fix it. If I knew about this happening, I would do something. And, you know, we could just sort of go, it is happening in our world over there, or here, or there, and you're not doing anything about it. We like to think that we would always spring into action as hero. And that's part of one of the reasons why a lot of heroic fantasy is so engaging. We can imagine ourselves on the side of good. And yet a lot of what Erikson did challenges that and go, are you? Are you on the side of good, or are you on the side of turning a blind eye because it's expedient? And I think his training as an anthropologist and as an archaeologist, that part of that gave him the detachment to go, right, this is an aspect of contemporary society, but let's go back in time a bit. Let's look at the sides where we don't know who was the good guy, who was the bad guy. Anthropologists don't do that when they are studying things. They try to see what happened without making those judgments. And if that becomes a sort of conceptual lens through which you view events, it influences how you tell a story. And with that shifting perspective, with understanding how fallible and frail our humanity actually is, that an understanding that civilization, that old cliche that if you scratch at the barest surface of civilization, underneath you find seething barbarism. But even the term barbarism that we use, savagery, that there is a veneer of civilization that quite often we fool ourselves being much deeper than it actually is. And any anthropologist will tell you, yeah, but that's obvious. And so I think that part of his training is obviously coming to the fore because he sees it as obvious.
I mean, I completely agree with you there. I guess where I've always had sort of my own, where I've always found Erikson's approach to this to be very interesting and very, very different is in his portrayal of the indigenous peoples and the resistance as well. I mean, and I can afford to say this because often when we look at the portrayal of the freedom fighters and the anti-colonial blah, 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 it often, at least to me, it seems as if the author is bending over backwards to sort of give people like me a pat on the back of, oh, here you are. I mean, there's the evil empire and the people who resisted are brave, noble freedom fighters and stuff like that. But we obviously have many, many episodes in the 10 big books where Erikson takes a huge risk. I would say, I mean, right from the Morant walking into slaughter people all the way until books 9 and 10. Another example I can think of is with the fate that Birithil meets, where it's at the hands of a savage that Birithil actually meets his end. And if it had been the Malazan Empire that had put an end to that practice, that would have given a completely different twist to the argument that Erikson was making, because that would have almost fit into the kind of whatever Kipling British Empire Sati justification, right? So
Yeah.
In terms of Erikson taking risks, which is what I keep coming back to in his portrayal of colonialism and local peoples and stuff like that, what do you think were some of the brave choices that he made in the 10 Big Books?
Well, I think some of the best literature that we ever read is full of risk taking like that. It might work out, it might not, it might fall flat on its face, but at least there's the attempt to try. And the downside to this obviously is, even if the risk works for some people, because it is such a distinctive flavor to the text, it is never going to be as mainstream as something that has had the rough edges sanded off to make it smoother and more palatable and to go down easier. So I think one of the massive risks that Erikson took in all of this was to not pander to an audience, to not talk down to an audience, to stick to his perspective of, no, these are things that are important that I want to talk about. But I think any white author trying to create believable non-white tribes and natives and savages and barbarians, that as soon as you start applying those words and concepts, you first have to challenge your own assumptions. And I think for the most part, Erikson has done so very, very successfully, because rather than falling into the stereotype of the noble savage, perfect example of this is Coltane. Coltane could have so easily been the noble savage, the more noble than the Malazans themselves. He was true honor. But how do we see him first? We see him from a Malazan perspective as a savage, as a barbarian, as dirty and disgusting. We make all those judgments because the Malazans are. And then with a signal, absolute control over the situation, absolute discipline, and our assumptions are challenged. He makes difficult decisions all the way through. Yes, he is honorable. Yes, he is intelligent and strategic, but he also views and weighs things differently. And we see that contrast, that he is treated, and in fact, I think the vast majority of the Wiccans are treated as rounded, real people. They are not dismissed as stereotypes. They are not dismissed as 2D cardboard cutout archetypes. And it's not to venerate without any awareness of weakness. It's not to blame as savage without any awareness of inherent good qualities. It was an attempt to create a view of, like all peoples, a flawed people who had strengths, like all of the different tribes, races, civilizations, countries that we see. Very few of them, I think, are depicted in any way that is entirely negative. Some are certainly heavily, heavily criticized, but they are not entirely negative. And I think if you think one of the dominant media forms in cinema and TV, the Western was so influential on a cultural consciousness about Native peoples, about Native Americans and First Nation in Canada. It created these stereotypes. And a lot of us who were not directly in contact with First Nation or Native Americans never had those challenged. And a lot of the fiction that played into it built on those stereotypes. And I believe that challenging those assumptions is not just for Native peoples to do. It should be challenged by people who are not Native, and certainly not supplant their voices, but add to it and go, no, this is wrong. Let's look at it with more complexity. And I think that desire for complexity is not just shown to the Native or tribes people in the novels, but also shown to the civilizations, also shown to the different empires and kingdoms, that no one escapes this. There's a line in Shaw's Pygmalion that has temporarily escaped me, but it goes along the lines of Eliza complains that Higgins is not like the other characters, but he treats a flower girl like a duchess. And Higgins replies, but I treat a duchess like a flower girl. He treats everyone badly. So it's a form of equality. Everyone suffers under the same treatment. And I think that's part of what Erikson did. He didn't have special treatment for any particular group, that everyone got the same critical eye. But because of narrative structure and because of what he was doing with it, I think some do come out ahead of others. It's not that he's saying they're all equal and all equally the same and all equal in good and badness. There are things represented to us, and we get to judge what aspects of it are too much or what aspects of it we are willing to forgive. The narrative very rarely does that.
And it never feels tokenistic. That's one thing that I've always mentioned. This, as you pointed out, because everybody has a bit of a critical eye and he does such a good job of getting into each character's perspective, at least to me, it never felt tokenistic in terms of the diversity of the cast or whatever it is. I will say one thing, AP, you mentioned that we first look at Coltrane as a savage because we're looking through the eyes of the Malazans. That's your buddy Malik Rel, AP. That's the doing of your friend Mr. Malik Rel right there. And Malik Rel to me is another great example of how Erikson has such a deep understanding of colonial politics that he knows how to stab us in the heart without making Malik Rel a stereotypical colonial villain, because Malik Rel is a stand-in for, I would say in many ways, a sort of a post-colonial politician as well. And what really makes us hate Malik Rel is, yes, of course, there's the end of Deadhouse Gates with Coltrane getting crucified and all that. But the fact that he never gets his comeuppance, and the fact that the Malazan Empire is the reason he does not get his comeuppance, as in the Malazan Empire, as with all historical empires, has to make peace with its enemies for its own political survival. And this sort of parallels with real life imperial politics without it being shoved down our throats was a major, at least for me, when I read Deadhouse Gates and then transition into some of the later books like The Bone Hunters and all that, where we see that storyline come up again. I had so much appreciation for it. And for me, personally, as a reader, it's things like that that kept me going through the 10 big books, because obviously, I mean, guys, as you know, or as you might not know, AP and I are we actually have very, very different takes on the Malazan Book of the Fallen, right? So I am one of the gatekeepers whom AP warns you about, right? Just as how there's Hood's Gate in the Malazan world, there's Ruthan's Gate as well. And I guard that gate very deep. I personally feel like AP feels that Malazan is for everybody. I don't. AP feels that one read through is kind of, you will get a substantial amount out of your first read through. I personally don't, right? I mean, AP likes Malik Rel, I don't, right? So, but for me, this subtle commentary and this nuanced take on politics and colonial politics in general was such a big part of what kept me reading. And it was such a big part of what I connected with, because I can't imagine that reading experience ever being duplicated or replicated in my mind ever again. Because I think I mentioned this in my interview with Philip as well. When I read the 10 big books, when I just finished it, if someone had told me that 7 years later, I would have a YouTube channel dedicated to these books, I would have said, get the fuck out of here. I would have said, there's a lot of great stuff in these books. There's a lot of stuff that I connect with, but there's absolutely no way that I would become Ruth and Bad. And of course, like most readers, as memories percolate, as I read other stuff, I warmed up to the series, and here I am, right, discussing the series and psychoanalyzing Steven Erikson with Dr. A.P. Canavan. But to you, because you, even though you don't pass the melanin pigment test, unfortunately, you do pass the history test, the legacy test. So did you connect with it on a post-colonial level the way that I did? Or were you approaching it more as a scholar?
Well, I certainly had a very personal appreciation of it. And as you pointed out, like, we come at it from different angles. We come at it from different experiences. And I think some minor aspects of it do overlap. But for me, one of the big things, it wasn't just about there weren't token characters or like the token colored friend who gets brought in. That's so uncomfortable. When all of the characters are white and then there's a character of color is brought in as the token, and it leaves a bad taste in your mouth. What I really appreciated about this was, first of all, a truly diverse world from its inception, where the politics of gender had been greatly nullified because particularly within the Malazan Empire. And then there are contrasts put in to show that, to help illustrate it. But sexuality was something that was pretty much accepted and irrelevant, because in a world where the dragons and people who can turn into wolves and giant elf-like creatures and troll-like creatures, you go, do you really care who the person next to you sleeping with? Not really, no. You just get on with life. That a lot of that created a very fundamental sense to me for the world. And I went, yeah, okay, I appreciate that. But the big thing was, it was the fact that the structures of power were being addressed. You brought up Malik Rel. Malik Rel isn't a mustache twirling villain. Malik Rel is the product of a system. And the product of the system becomes a tool of the system to help perpetuate the system. And suddenly, systems of control, systems of power are at the center of so many of these stories. It's not about the individual. It's not about Anamander Rake standing there like, he's awesome, he's cool. But it's not, we don't really get into the Tiste and the sort of politics. That's irrelevant. What is relevant are the political machinations within the Malazan Empire, are the treaties they've made with other races or clans, or it's about the balance of power within the empire. It's about the imbalance of power outside of the empire. The kingdom of Lethari. It's all about how that system of power is held in place, how it self-perpetuates, how it elevates certain people. The Tiste and their society is broken down in terms of the power dynamics and the structures. That yes, all of these characters are products of their society, and either they accept it or they rail against it. But they're not just figures, they're not tokens. They are part of an examination of the systems that control. And that understanding and picking apart of power dynamics, systems of control, concepts of government and control, A, appealed to me as a structuralist, but B, I thought was such a fascinating way to do this in fantasy, where so often we are focused on the individual heroes as if they can change everything. When you think about it and go, oh, they might be a hero. And if they won and took over, the system that they took over would grind them down into the correct shape to perpetuate the system again. And that was the fascinating look that really brought me in to thinking about and being fascinated by the Malazan Book of the Fallen.
So
does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It makes perfect sense. And I'm glad you segued us into Lethari as well, because I think that's the other major sort of portrayal that impressed me. The fact that this guy has two expansionist empires in the series, and they're both so vastly different from each other. The Malazan Empire and the Lethari Empire are so similar, yet so different. And this can only be done when someone understands imperialism at a very, very deep level, where many of the common tropes that we see with the empire, so such as an expansionist foreign policy, a sort of an industrialist, capitalist economic system, the exploitation of slaves and wage laborers, the treatment of indigenous populations. Even though both the Malazan Empire and the Lethari Empire displayed all these tropes, they're done so fundamentally differently. I mean, with the Lethari Empire, I would say Erikson does. I haven't read Daniel Abraham, but I've been told that he does a lot of really great stuff with the economics in a fantasy world and all that. So I hear that A Dagger and a Coin is only like 1,500 pages or something in total. So I might read that sometime next month. But what did you think of the portrayal of economics, capitalism, and all that in the portrayal of the Lethari Empire? But Erikson never really goes the sort of the communist chess beating route either. It's all done in such a sophisticated way.
Well, obviously, I am not an expert in politics, nor am I an expert in economics. That's not the area and focus that I have. So anything that I say is obviously tinged with AP doesn't know what he's talking about in that regard. But what made it interesting for me is it wasn't an allegory to any specific modern day capitalist society. It wasn't. The reason I think a lot of us map certain modern day societies onto it and read it as allegory is because that's the society that we know, and the hyperfixation of capitalism within Lether creates it makes us sort of go, well, hang on a sec, that is like this. But when we think of how Lether is set up, the focus on capitalism, the focus on trade, the whole thing about the seals for their blubber and their ivory and their skins. So taking a step back from that, you can think of the whale hunting in the 18th and 19th centuries, or we can go further back and think of it just, or further away from it in the abstract, any sort of resource. Oh yes, because the Silk Road, the trade of spices, the trade of silk, the trade of pigments, anywhere that had a specialist resource that a civilized society wanted. Flags suddenly got planted in the territory, and it was, well, we're here for your own good, we're going to look after you, we're going to civilize you, and we're just going to help ourselves while we're here. And that is Imperial History 101. It doesn't matter what period of history, what empire that you are looking at. It's not pointing the finger at any one in particular, but it's drawing those broad strokes of a capitalist system that looks to exploit an area, to drain it of resources for gain, and the gain is for the people in control, and there is a mechanism where everyone else is slaving underneath, the toiling underneath, to propagate this and to create more profits for the people on top. And that's not a criticism just of the modern day. Think of all of those, the noble classes, the patrician classes, the robber barons, the oil barons, any period in history, there were always those people at the top that owned everything, that the money funneled upwards, and let's face it, the shit fell downwards. That's what happened. And so when we see Lether broken down in those terms, on the one hand, it treats men and women equally. You either have money or you don't. Money is the thing that decides it. Doesn't matter what sex you are, what gender you are, what sexuality you are. Doesn't really even matter the color of your skin. It's the color of the coins in your pouch. And if you have those, you're one of the elite. If you don't have those, tough luck. And it's equally fair because of that. It is an expansionist empire because one of the things is, in order to perpetuate, it needs to constantly feed. It needs to get more and more resources. So it needs to constantly expand. Now, how many times have you heard people talking about, oh, the economy isn't expanding at the minute, or we fear it may shrink and drop into recession? You go, who sets up a system where the only way it can be seen as good is when it is expanding? Systems cannot expand infinitely. No system has infinite expansion. There is a problem if that is how your system is set up, that it must continue to always expand and consume ever and ever greater amounts of resources. Either you get an infinite amount of resources, or you change the limitation of the system. And that's what Erikson is looking at. The Lethari system is constantly looking at new territories to control, exploit, remove all of the resources for, to feed this mechanism, to feed this system, to then, where's the next place? And the next place. And they do it for human chattel slavery. They do it for wage slavery. Even within the slave class, the type of slave that you are you an indebted slave because you owed a debt? That's worse than being an ordinary slave. Like, even within the slave class, and you look at in a lot of capitalist societies, instead of looking and criticizing those who have the most power, it's always, well, you got more of that handout than I did. And it's infighting at the lowest possible levels, because that's where we are, and that's what we can see. And we don't see the people who are living metaphorically miles above us on these luxury clouds and living an existence that we could never even dream of. We are down in the dirt. That's who we see, because that's where we are. And like, the amount of money that some people in the modern day earn, and by earn, they don't actually have to do anything. It's just money they get because of investments and ownership interests and funds and all of these sort of trust funds and stuff like that. The amount of money that they get is more money than any one of us is going to see in a lifetime. And we can't wrap our head around it. We honestly cannot wrap our head around how rich some people are. And the system perpetuates that. And so, do you blame the person that is the beneficiary of the system? Or do you start looking at the system? And that approach that Erikson takes, where he goes, yes, I'm going to give you example characters. I'm going to show you the people who live here. I'm going to show you a conflict that arises. But behind all of it is this mechanistic breakdown of systemic inequality. And each of them are going to be slightly different. Lethari is all about capitalism, whereas the Malazan Empire, it is slightly more nebulous than that. It seems more about expansion of territory and control. And certainly, like, the Wiccans are allowed to self-identify within the empire. But at the same time, you know that in 4, 5, 10, 30 generations, Wiccan culture will cease to exist because they will become fully assimilated. That it is a slow death of culture. But at the same time, the benefit of that, and it's hard to call it a benefit, but one of the reasons that convinced the Wiccans to agree to this was to stop the continuous warfare between clans that was constantly whittling them down, that was constantly preventing anyone from advancing or doing more, because they were constantly at war with each other. They were constantly raiding each other. They were constantly killing each other. Now that they're all part of the empire, they have a chance to grow and to settle down and to see their kids grow up without being killed in a raid. And yet there's a transfer of individuality for security. And it was done as a people. And it's complex. It's not simple. It's not straightforward. And Erikson is certainly not saying, oh, colonialism, good. But it shows you that these things are not as straightforward. I live in Northern Ireland. The language I speak is English. I live on the island of Ireland, but the language I speak is English. The islands, even though this is the island of Ireland, the islands here are collectively known as the British Isles, because the other island is called Great Britain. The complexity of that arrangement is not easy to unpack. And it's not simple. It is not a simple binary. And admitting that complexity in a fantasy novel, and not again as a polemic or a didactic, you must believe, but using that complexity as a background, actually thinking about it instead of, yeah, it's another kingdom. Oh, look, it's another one where King evil guy is in charge, Prince good guy has been banished, and we must go with him to try and take down King evil guy. You know, it's never simplified like that.
I completely agree, AP, and I was hoping that you would touch on your own story as well. One of my favorite sort of, I guess, comparisons between the Malazans and the Lethari don't really have to do with the Malazans and the Lethari, but it's that the counterpoint to the Malazan Empire is kind of Karsa, while the counterpoint to the Lethari Empire is Tehol. As in, Karsa is a sort of a political and territorial anarchist, where he wants to break the shackles and all that, while Tehol is an economic and sort of social anarchist, where he wants to bring down the economic structures of that. And in a way, the two major sort of, Karsa shuts down the cultural practices that the Malazan Empire should be shutting down. And Tehol breaks some of the economic practices that the Tiste Edo should have broken. So that's one thing. Another, one of my favorite, not quotes, but I can't remember where Erikson said this, but when he was asked where he got the inspiration for the city of Lether itself, Erikson said that he wanted a city that had a lot of canals and that was constantly building on one layer on top of the other, because he wanted it to be a metaphor for unending industrial wealth, where you have no choice but to just keep building and building and building until everything below you ultimately got destroyed. So I want to touch on another thing that you said, because as you pointed out, when we look at the Lethari Empire itself or the Malazan Empire, it's easy for us to transpose our own sort of knowledge base about empires on it. And I think you and I have had this chat off camera before, where I've told you that I often get very frustrated by people who tell me that they are history aficionados. And it turns out that, okay, that all they know about are the Greeks and the Romans. They wouldn't really be able to have a conversation about the Assyrians, about the Cholas, about the Mughals, about the Tang dynasty, whatever. To me, so India was ruled for a long time by the Mughal dynasty for centuries. Babur, Akbar, Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal, blah, blah, blah. And what I always found fascinating about the Mughals in India is that even though they captured India militarily, the culture and politics of India kind of ended up consuming them, where even though they were a very strict theocratic Islamic society, India still remained very deeply Hindu and polytheistic. And if anything, it kind of swallowed the conqueror into that fold, which is kind of what happens to the Tiste Edo when they land up in Lether, right? Where they kind of get swallowed up by this existing civilization, where this tribal population has the ferocity to militarily conquer an empire. But the ideology and the existing social standing of that civilization ends up kind of swallowing the savage itself. So it's funny that you mentioned the whole transposing thing, because I had put in the Mughals in India there. That's the analogy that I always saw. So the next question I wanted to ask you about sort of this colonialism. Were you going to say something?
Well, how's it? Because you had mentioned Karsa and Tehol, and I thought one of the interesting things is Karsa is an external factor. Karsa wants to stop this, and he is external. He is coming in to wreck. You know, that's the presumed position. Tehol, on the other hand, is internal. He's going to take it down from the inside. Now, which is more successful? In the Malazan Book of the Fallen, in the 10 big books, which of them is successful?
Tehol.
But is Tehol successful? What does he achieve? Has he stopped Lethar being a hyper-capitalist, hyper-focused society?
No.
When he launches on his program of trying to stop the deforestation so that you can actually have regulated deforestation, that you lumber, that instead of getting it all now, you set up a system of growing the trees so that the soil is going to remain, and he wants to do it, but he can't just outright do that. He's working within the system and finds he cannot enact change too quickly, otherwise the system would get rid of him. And so he's limited, even though he is the king, even though he is the richest person. He is limited in what he can do because he is working within the system and he has to work within the system's rules. Karsa, on the other hand, outside of the system, what is limiting him? And what is limiting him is his potentially misunderstanding of what empire is. That he looks at it and goes, this is terrible, I'll just smash everything. And you go, you can't smash empire. You can't take a sword and go, that's what empire is, that thing there, I'll just hit it. Because the empire is this concept. It is a mechanism. And we have gone through multiple imperial leaders, emperor, empress, in the series. The Malazan Empire doesn't really change. Not to any significant political extent. It's still the Malazan Empire, still recognizably the Malazan Empire. Doesn't matter who's in charge, it kind of self-perpetuates. Now, it can run slightly more smoothly or slightly more erratically, but essentially it self-perpetuates. You go, so what's Karsa going to do? You cut the head off the snake and the snake goes, yeah, but I didn't need the head. The snake's going to keep going. And that's one of the things that I find fascinating about this is there is no easy fix, either from inside or outside. But both approaches need to understand what it is that they are trying to change. And I think ultimately, Tehol is going to be the one who will be able to enact the greatest amount of change, but it'll take generations. Because what you need to change is the entire culture. And you can only do that incrementally. Because you make a change, you have generational impact. And you have to wait until it becomes normalized, where it isn't looked at as the change. And we haven't had enough time pass in the Malazan world yet to see what the long-term ramifications are of a lot of these things. But
so, go on.
Oh no, but I was going to say, so it was the fact that one internal, one external, I thought was a very interesting way that you had paired them up to show these different approaches. And that's one of the things I think signals that. But what do you think about that?
So yeah, I mean, I find that fascinating. And would you say that Redmask is kind of a hybrid of the two, where he is an internal whatever product of he is a Lethari, if I remember right, but he fights for the outsiders without even the outsiders being aware of the fact that he's Lethari. Would you say that Redmask is kind of a mix of this internal external dynamic?
But he's certainly fascinating because everything about him is claiming to be external, but he is a product of the internal. And his failure is that instead of trying to address the needs of the people ostensibly he is helping, it is about vengeance and his need and desire to punish. So it's about the individual needs, which is very much the internal concept of Lethari. It's about what the individual wants rather than what's good for the society. You expressed this very well in your discussion about the Imas as the collective above all, and the Jagat as hyper-focused on individualism. That when you take them to extremes, and quite often that's what we do in literature, we look at extreme cases because it is easier to see their outlines. And you go, it's not, that's why it's never a one-to-one. It's always trying to go, here's an extreme case so that we can clearly see it. Now, smudge the edges of it a bit, blur the sides of it, start shifting it in, and you'll see how it then fits with a whole load of different areas, depending on where you put the blurs in. And it's not that all capitalism is bad or all communism is good. Those are not messages in it. There are strengths and weaknesses to all approaches. Hyper-individualism, we see the Jagat and you go, well, actually, we like the majority of the Jagat, except when they become tyrants. The Imas, oh, it's great. When Karsa picks the person up and says, today I will be your village, you go, oh, that's such a lovely sentiment. The Imas live their life where all Imas are the village until they go on a mass genocidal rampage, because that's what they collectively decided to do. Again, the rejection of simplistic binaries, simplistic labels, to look at it as, here is a complex picture. We would be here forever to go over every single nuance. So I'm going to give you some parts of it and illustrate it so that you can think about it. And by thinking about those parts, extrapolate others. Think about the argument behind it. Apply it in different situations. Twist it a little bit to see how it fits something else. And it's placing that in the text. And then placing a story on top of it. So it's not just about, oh yeah, I'm going to tell you a story about capitalism.
You brought up the other races as well. And this is going to be a bit of an out there question, right? But bear with me, AP. If anyone can answer this question, it's got to be you, right? So what do you think about some of the non-human alternatives to colonialism that we see with the power structures practiced by the non-human races? Because in the field that I teach, international relations, we've had this debate for centuries of whether the power structures that we see in imperialism, or whether it's something inherent to human nature or not. When we look at the non-human races in Malazan, we have, the Tilan with their collective. Of course, the Jagut story we find out is slightly different in the Karkanis trilogy, and stuff like that. With the folklore assail, we have this very ideological system of power. With the Kachen Chamal, we have this hive-like hierarchy of power where there's a queen and there's a nest and things like that. Of course, the Tiste races, I suppose, would be the closest to the human races in terms of how they structure power. But I was wondering what your take was on that, and how many of these non-human races have a slightly different approach to colonialism in terms of spreading out power.
Well, I mean, the story of the Kachen Chamal is fascinating, because obviously when we consider not necessarily exactly what we see happening in the later books, but when we think about their history, where they had their floating hive and they float along and harvest their resources. They go down, they take the things, and they move on. It's a tribe, that sort of society that lives on the steppes, has grazing and pasture, and is constantly moving. That's what they do. It's a hunter-gatherer society, despite their sophistication. But their internal structure of the queen, and then blending out of the memories, where you're able to see thoughts. You can't lie in a society like that. That it is a collective, but people we abhor that concept of being born into, this is your role and you must fit this pigeonhole, because we have such strong individualistic desires and we are encouraged in that regard. And the idea of being born a worker drone, that you're only ever going to be a worker drone. You can't be a really good worker drone and get promoted to being a warrior drone. The film, what was it, the animated film Ants, I think, was about that. Because that makes sense to us. But in their society, that's how things function. And there is comfort and security to that because it's about the collective. But that's very, very alien to us, which then makes us think, because it's showing us that in sharp relief, which makes us think about our individualism and the strengths of it, that we can be born in one position and we can rise, or we can be born in a very high position and fall, that there is meant to be movement in our society. And then when we think about, has society become too static, too stratified, that now actually when you're born in a certain echelon, forever will you remain there? That it brings into question those aspects of our existence simply by showing us it in the text, in contrast to who we are. And I think that's fascinating. The stuff about the Tiste is, again, portraying a tribal society. There are gender divides in that society, but there is power held on both sides of that divide. So again, it's looking, and it's a very family-oriented, clan-oriented, specific to bloodlines, which again is something that we struggle with in terms, we like meritocracy. And then you think, oh, well, what dynasty is going to be running the country now? Who has the old boy network working for them? It doesn't have to be literal bloodlines, but it can be about nepotism or connections or networking made. Did you go to the right school? Did you go to the right university? Were you in the right clubs at the right university? Did you choose the right subject? Did you wear the right outfit? Do you have the right accent? That while these things are in abstract, they are not the specific focus of the story, but these are all part and parcel of how these societies and civilizations are constructed. When you think of Clip and his attitude toward Animander and the Tiste, but Nimander and his attitude and that group, the society on Drift Valley, they don't function the same way. So what is Tiste society? And then in the Carcanis books, obviously, a lot of our assumptions about it are immediately challenged and broken apart.
All of them.
Because we are now seeing where they came from. What we saw in the Malazan Book of the Fallen is how they ended up and the different ways of dealing with it. But the Tiste, again, for the most part, wander. And then you think, well, what about Blue Rose? But that's not the wandering Tiste Andy of Animander Rake. It's an entirely different situation. So again, even within that, there are different approaches. Do you assimilate? Do you carry on with your own traditions? Do you integrate? Do you become part of the society but segregate? All of these are different aspects that we get shown examples of in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. But even though we are talking about this, we are very much focused on this topic. The books aren't focused on that. It is part of the makeup of the world. Because if you remember back to like classic Star Trek, they landed on a planet and it was all ancient Greek. And by ancient Greek, it was a bunch of people in togas. And then they land on a planet and it's ancient Rome. And again, it was just basically a bunch of people in togas. And it was very much the upper echelons of those societies were represented. And it was the simplified, cartoonized form of what you think of ancient Grecian city-states, what you think of ancient Rome, and the gradual expansion of the Roman Empire. When they went down and there was, oh, look, it's an Egyptian world, and it's the Egyptian court. Again, always looking at that rarefied. air at the top of these social pillars, because no one wants to look at the dirty, gritty slave end of it. They want the beautiful palace ballrooms and the eating grapes on a chaise longue. No one asks where the grapes came from.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. So what do you think about the way in which some of the Tiste races, particularly the leadership, almost rejects the power hierarchy that comes with an imperial system? Like Anamander Rake is very clearly a reluctant king, if we could even call him that. Osirk for the Tiste Leosin is even more of a reluctant leader, because he almost seems to know that the Tiste Leosin will try to sort of use the typical colonial trick, using his name and using his authority, and he kind of almost seems to run away from that. The only Tiste leader who seems to want to be the head of this big powerful movement is Skandabari Bloodeye, who then gets his ass kicked, right? So that's one thing I always found interesting. AP, just give me a second. My dog is sort of Juno, please, Juno, just give me one. Okay, guys, we're back now. We just had to take a brief break, guys. So I was asking AP what his take was on the Tiste races and their rejection of leadership and the type of kind of power structures that might lead to imperialism. But I think AP gave us a satisfactory answer, and come on, fuck the Tiste standee anyway, right? So AP, before we end this discussion, I wanted us to touch on a few of the individuals whom I think Erikson uses for very deep commentary about a civilization, colonialism. Have you ever discussed Samar Dev before, AP? I would be fascinated to hear what you, because I've always thought that the dynamic between Samar Dev and Karsa is a microcosm for the debate between civilization and barbarism. So what do you think of Samar Dev and the role that she plays in the philosophy of all this?
And I think this is one of the best dialogues that occurs between these different concepts. Samar Dev, obviously, as this sort of articulation of the ideal of civilization, talking to who she perceives as the barbaric. And then you have Karsa, obviously, as the articulation of tribal, not barbaric, tribal, looking at the articulation of the disgusting, corrupt civilization. And so they both have their dialectic positions. And what we have is Samar Dev having her preconceptions about what she values in civilization and her misconceptions about what she criticizes or thinks to criticize in Karsa's civilization. And it is only by seeing the contrast that she becomes aware of unconscious bias, of assumptions that she is making, and that the things that she had always assumed as truisms are actually not as fixed as she thought. And with Karsa, Karsa gets challenged in exactly the same way, because he had seen the corruption of civilization, and yet he sees in Samar Dev the benefits of civilization and this new way of living, that it is not as simple as us and them. It's not as simple as either or. It is an understanding of the complexity of what is actually at stake. And it's like we've been talking about in terms of, it's not that the civilization as a concept is all evil. It is a giant system. And Karsa suddenly realizes that just smashing the system, what do you leave it with? How do you do it? And of course, his ideal is every village. And yet through Samar's questioning of him, he has that entire interrogation of his village background, the isolationism, which was a problem, the ritual practices that they had and never questioned because they never looked outside their own borders. Whereas in Samar Dev, he sees She's well educated. She knows about these distant lands. She knows about these different traditions. She has different ways of articulating. And of course, Karsa with his too many words, because he wants to cut to the chase. But Karsa is not dumb. Karsa is not a brute. Karsa is not any of those things. He is incredibly intelligent. And it's through his discussion with Samar Dev, he begins to get the words to help him crystallize his interrogation of the mechanisms of civilization. Because without those words, you are left with these vague concepts. But if you can name a concept, if you can make specific parts of it, you can start getting very specific. You can look at the working parts. And that, for him, is this, in some ways, humbling experience. Because Samar Dev has not defeated him in combat. But in a lot of respects, she has entirely defeated him by blunting his attack on civilization, by going, you don't know what you're doing. Let's talk about it. And for her, it's entirely humbling for her, because she starts off with such a high opinion of herself and such an incredibly low opinion of this brutish animal. All he's good for is lifting the cart up and pulling things up. Bad, Karsa, don't hit the guards. You dumb brute. You know, that's her attitude. And yet, through her exposure, she sees, no, it is ignorance in the sense of not knowing, not ignorance in the pejorative, but ignorance in the lack of knowledge, not lack of ability. And her experience of that suddenly makes her question. And that makes her realize that, yes, she has never interrogated or questioned her society the way that she did others. She was always outward looking. To a great, well, I shouldn't say always. She was almost always outward looking, that she had that position looking out at people. And now she's directing it inward, not only at herself, but at her concepts of civilization and calling them into question with the same rigor that she had applied to others. In fact, better rigor, because now she knows that she misjudged others. So she's in a position to learn, to reevaluate. And so the dialogue between the two is absolutely fascinating, because we have, again, that moment where Karsa is, I will be your village. This idea that in the village, everyone looks after each other. We have it in our own sort of idiom of, it takes a village to raise a child. This idea that we come together as a community. But if civilization can be an expanded community, then surely that is an ideal. But when it gets to a certain size, then you need mechanisms in place to help organize. And then you need mechanisms to organize the mechanisms. And next thing you know, we have built up the same structure again. So the books are not a blueprint for how to tear down civilization, but they ask the questions about what norms do we accept without thinking? What assumptions do we make without thinking? Why do we assume that this is the only way to do something? Why is this considered normal? What are the things that we accept as normal? To start asking those questions. Because the more we know about our own society, the better able we are to see the similarities and the benefits of other societies. And that builds a bridge of empathy. And again, I know we trot out compassion and empathy every time we talk about the Malazan Book of the Fallen, but it's about communication between points, not arguing, I am right and you are wrong. It's about a dialogue where both sides learn and both sides can refine their positions, and maybe a consensus point can be reached. And that, for me, the dialogue between Samar Dev and Karsa, they are physically disparate. They are opposite ends of the spectrum. Intellectually, she's learned, he's a barbarian. Everything about them is meant to be these polar opposites. And yet we see a meeting of minds. And that, I think, is one of the symbols that works its way through the whole thing. And to refer to your point about the Tiste, Anamander reluctantly tries to find things for his civilization to do. Leoric and Osiric abandon their responsibilities. Anamander doesn't abandon. He tries to find things to stop the fall into ennui. Osiric abandons and lets a theocratic, sort of fascistic regime take hold. They become zealots because it's a very strange situation, all fixed on worship, that he could have corrected. But again, Mother Dark turned her back on the Tiste. So that's why Anomander had to step into the role, but he didn't want to be worshipped. So it's more complex than I think we'd set out in the other one. And so throughout the book, we have these characters who lust for power, who want power for power's sake. The errant being one. He wants power because he wants power. The Liberty Consign, they want power because they want economic power to do whatever they want. The Patriotists, they want power because they feel victimized, not to make everyone else's life better. Tehol wants power to make other people's lives better. While we have this debate about impact and intentionality, does intentionality ever matter? Or is it only impact? And you go, there is a difference. For someone who is the victim, the impact is the most important thing. But even then, intentionality still matters. And to illustrate this, if someone is walking down the street towards you and they trip and stumble and accidentally stand on your foot, you have had someone stand on your foot, they've hurt your foot, the impact is your foot is hurt. But it was a complete and utter accident. And that person, when they get up, they go, oh, I am so sorry, because even though it was unintentional, they know that they caused you a wound. They apologize. Someone else is coming down the street and the person behind them shoves them and they stand on your foot. And they go, I'm so sorry, because again, they understand the impact is they hurt you, but it wasn't their fault. They were shoved. It wasn't their agency. Someone else did it. And in fact, the person who caused all of this is the person behind them. And that's the person really who the apology should come from. But when we cause an impact like that, we apologize because it is the decent thing to do. But if someone's walking down the street and they see you and they walk up to you and deliberately stand on your foot, they intentionally did it. And that person, if they say sorry at all, is going to say it very sarcastically because they meant to wound you. And there is a difference. Intentionality, the intention behind the act, is important. And with all of this discussion about these different systems, about these different styles of leadership, about the different leaders and what's going on, I think one of the aspects that we frequently overlook is the intention behind their act. Anomander acts for good or for ill with the intention of helping his people. Osiric acts for the intention of helping himself. Calor acts to help himself, but he has been cursed by another and therefore it's not going to work. Malik Rel is acting on behalf of both the Empire because he can do it better than anyone else, and himself because, well, if he can do it better than anyone else, he might benefit from it. He might as well benefit from it. And intentionality here actually becomes a very interesting aspect of looking at these characters, why we see some as heroic and why we see some as villainous, and unpicking that. When we look at characters who have failed up and sometimes arrived at the position of fist or high fist, not you, of course, but clearly are not capable. They have failed upwards. They're being manipulated by someone else. Yes, they still deserve condemnation and blame for what they do, but we have to look at the person behind them who has shoved them there. And that is something to consider. Lysine gets criticized all the time for what she deems pragmatic in terms of realpolitik about things. And yet her intentionality, even though it results in devastating impacts for certain people, for the body politic, for the entirety of the empire, it might actually be beneficial. And so we get into her intention, utilitarian philosophy, and the weighing up of the needs of the many against the needs of the few. That when we start trying to unpick these things, when we think about the dialogue between what is barbarism? Is barbarism a civilization that eats its own, that has an underclass that is mined as a resource? Is that barbarism? Or is barbarism a small-scale insular society where everyone knows each other and feuds break out and there's a bit of fisticuffs, but ultimately the tribe, the clan, the family stand together. Is that barbarism? That we now have to actually call into question the terminology used and the connotations behind that terminology, that the negative associations we have with savagery and savage, barbarism and barbarian. Looking at those negative connotations, go, are they justified? What is the rationale for them in this context? And those questions are subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, interwoven through the 10 books.
So speaking of subtly and not so subtly, I have this theory that Shadowthrone's personality is the best metaphor for the way that civilization and colonialism is handled in the series, because we never really get an answer for whether he's insane or crazy. I mean, sorry, whether he's smart or just batshit crazy. Just like how we don't really get an explanation for whether colonialism is smart or an act of craziness. We never get an answer for whether he's compassionate or evil, kind of like how we never really get a fixed answer for whether colonialism is compassionate or evil. We just see him do both things. And he is, of course, the emperor. So am I crazy, or do you think there are some parallels between his madness and the way that the colonial sort of debate is framed in the series?
To be honest, I never would have picked Shadowthrone to be that sort of metaphor. But now that you talk about it, Shadowthrone at some time seems to be acting in his own interests, and then sometimes for the interests of others, and sometimes against the interests of others. That it's complicated. So when we talk about colonialism, I don't want anyone to get the mistaken sort of impression that we think colonialism good. No, there is a cost, a very heavy cost through colonialism and imperialism. And that cost has to be weighed up against benefits. There are benefits. Whether or not we view the end result as a net positive or a net negative works on a calculation that has to be considered. But there is always cost, always cost. And when we think of Shadowthrone, do we think that his ascension, his giving up of a mortal life, was that a cost that he paid for his own betterment? Or was it just an experiment, something he went, I wonder where this is going? For me, Shadowthrone is not so much about civilization, it's about controlled chaos. And Shadow, the reason Shadow is so important in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, the reason why Shadow and Shadow imagery play such an important role, it is neither the default black or the default white. It is neither absolute position. It shifts in between. It can go from very, very dark to very, very pale. That it's in constant movement, in constant motion. It is the closest we get to organized chaos. Unbridled chaos is destructive, but it is also creative. Order is static, but solid. And so Shadowthrone is the mitigation between absolute positions. Shadow is the realm where change can actually occur. And in order to survive, we have to change. In order to survive, we have to adapt. In order to survive colonialism, we have to adapt. In order to grow beyond it, we have to adapt. That Shadow is, for me, this motif and symbol for the entire series, because it is in this shifting, endless pattern that constantly moves, cannot be pinned down, is not the solid substance, but encompasses everything and touches everything. That is why Shadow is so important to this, because it melds itself to the shapes around it. It gets into every nook and cranny. It finds out all of these secrets and absorbs them. And it is through that, that's knowledge, that's understanding. And it bridges the divide between the absolute positions. That the absolute positions are entrenched, but it is through shadow that we have compromise, we have connection, we have resolution, we have the ability to communicate.
AP, this is why at the start of the video, I said you were one of the few people capable of making me change my mind, because I actually like your analogy a bit better, which actually segues in quite nicely to my last question. So I've done a video on Calor, you've done a video on Calor. We both know that Calor is a highly misunderstood character, but in the context of this conversation, I would argue that Calor in many ways stands for the arrogance of colonialism, the hubris of empire, where every great colonial power believes that it will last forever, including the major empires that we see in the present world today. We look at American dominance, with many sort of convinced that American dominance would last forever. But anyone who studies human history knows that every empire eventually falls. Even if it rises again, it falls again. And Calor has this great quote in Toll the Hounds, where he's like, every civilization, every empire eventually crumbles, no matter what height it sort of reaches. And in many ways, I find him to be a sort of a parable for the delusional arrogance of colonial powers.
And hubris, the classic example of hubris. When we think, even if we take the most positive view of Calor, which obviously you and I have articulated on a couple of occasions, that he was a high king who was well respected. He had this massive kingdom and he was beloved by the majority of his subjects. Even if you take that, he was in control. He was in the position of power. He dictated, he ruled over, that there's still a hierarchy of power that benefited him. And some people resented that so much that there was the calling down of essentially the crippled god, and those comets, those strikes, wiped everyone out. And Calor could not imagine that anyone else was responsible, because it was his kingdom, and this was an attack on him. And the arrogance of assuming that he is at the center of everything. He can't even imagine the other people's reason for it. That's irrelevant, because he is the reason. And even as a philosopher king in the most benevolent sense possible, his hubris and arrogance is at his core. And when he's then confronted by the three elder gods and they curse him, he curses them right back. He doesn't try to explain or excuse the actions. He just accepts it. But from that moment on, he's doomed and he is cursed. And in a lot of ways, he is, as you point out, a symbol for the curse of civilization, that it will constantly strive to rise only to fail, to fall. That it will constantly struggle to take over and to amass power only to fail and to fall. That individual aspects may age and crumble away, but the seed of it will keep on going. It is insidious, and it will travel and it will contaminate new lands, and it will move on to the next one and the next one. And it is invariably violent. And that's the thing, colonialism is invariably violent, either literally and physically violent, or the violence done against culture, against history, against language, against people.
Your imagination can be colonized.
And all of these things are aspects of violence. Now, obviously, some result in you dying and others result in you speaking a language far different to that of your ancestors, or change of your culture, that you sometimes are feeling adrift. But Calor is intrinsically linked to violence, and this violence self-perpetuates. And it may be reluctant. At times, Calor's violence is very reluctantly unleashed. But when it is unleashed, it is devastating. And he always falls back on it. And so I think you are absolutely right. Calor is a fascinating aspect of this colonial impulse, of the quite Western impulse to take over lands and set up these hierarchies.
And on that grimdark note, AP, I would like to thank you for sparing me your time, for letting me pick your brain with some of these questions, because these are questions that will help me as well process my own thoughts about the series, and you've already given me a lot of stuff to steal and plagiarize. So thank you for that. I hope we can do this sometime soon again. As I said, it's a shame that this is our 8th video together and our first video where we actually discuss the 10 big books, despite the fact that I have a channel for the 10 big books, and and that's your kind of claim to fame as well. But that's the power of Baukelin, right? So thank you so much, Dr. A.P. Canavan, a critical dragon, ladies and gentlemen, for coming on board the Ruth Bad Express. Thank you.
And Ruthen, I would just like to say thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure. And just to assure anyone who is still watching this at this point, by no means are my opinions set in stone and declarative, and we have the, it's always in a constant flux of negotiation with the text, with these discussions with other people that open our eyes up to new ways of thinking about things. And I can be wrong. I'm an entirely fallible human being, but I like the fact that Ruthen Bad here has invited me on the channel to ask me, without warning me in advance, what these questions were going to be, but to have these kinds of discussions, to try to work through some of my own positions on it. That I really appreciate this. Thank you so much for this.
Awesome, AP. So let's do this soon again. Guys, you have to have enjoyed that. If you didn't enjoy it, I don't know, go dig a ditch somewhere, right? So thank you for joining us, and I'll see you soon, guys. Bye-bye.